Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session today. I am very delighted to have everyone with us. Today, we will be discussing more about the upcoming presidential elections. And as we all know, Syria is very far away from holding any free and fair elections, and conducting elections in the current circumstances is impossible, not to mention that it is even science fiction. Hence, these elections are just an illegitimate exercise by the Syrian regime in order to entrench its dictatorial rule. All Syrians have the right not only to vote, but to also run for office, hold rallies and political campaigns, and participate in political debates, which are a natural and normal part of any electoral process and any elections take place in any country. However, the current circumstances in Syria do not allow the Syrians to do any sort of political participation. These obstacles include constitutional obstacles, legal obstacles, logistical obstacles, as well as security obstacles. And these obstacles need to be overcome as part of a political solution whose cornerstone is a safe environment that ensures the participation of all Syrians, including the displaced Syrians. So today I would like to welcome with me Hannah Roberts, which is an elections expert working with ISIS to assess diaspora voting, Vladimir Pran, who is an electoral advisor, Karim Sharif, who is a Lebanese journalist, and Dr. Hala Al-Ghawi, who is a member of the Syrian Association for Citizen Dignity Board of Trustees. I would like to start first to welcome everyone, and I would like to start first with Dr. Hala. So Dr. Hala, most Syrians who are alive today, unfortunately, have never experienced free and fair elections in Syria, ever since the Hafiz al-Assad came to power, and after that he was succeeded by his son Bashar al-Assad. All the elections in Syria were merely political exercises designed to cement their grip on power. And we can see this very clearly with the latest example unfolding as we speak. So Dr. Hala, how do you think that the lack of trust that Syrians have in elections, where it is actually a tool for changing people's lives, how do you think that it is possible to reach a level of free and fair elections in Syria, especially that we have 13 million displaced Syrians, and especially that in one of SACD's surveys, which we conducted, more than 80% of the Syrians do not trust that any elections in Syria whatsoever would be legitimate and fair. What do you think should be done for Syria to become a country that's rights-based and a country in which we could actually hold free and fair elections? Dr. Hala, I can't hear you. I don't know if the rest of the guests can hear you.
Yeah, I was mute. Okay, thank you for this opportunity. And I think unless we have a comprehensive political agreement which will guarantee the rights for all Syrians to elect and also to run for office, and we couldn't have a free and confidential and trustful election in Syria. The constitutional obstacles must be changed, which prevent millions of Syrian IDPs and even refugees to have this right to participate in the election. Until safe and calm and secure circumstances for all Syrians to vote and to give their voices to the one they want, I think no trustful election can be done in Syria in these circumstances, as the people for now are fear and scared from just posting a post in Facebook. They couldn't express their opinion, so how they can in this situation can elect with free with freedom without any suppression from the regime and their its intelligence forces apparatus. So I think in this situation, unless a situation can change to safe and secure condition to allow Syrians to give their voices for the candidates and also to have the rights to run an office, the election in Syria cannot be done and cannot be trustful for now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hale. Indeed, safe environment is an essential cornerstone to ensure the participation of all Syrians. And you know that the association has done a lot of work with regards to this matter, and we are going to publish a very extensive paper very soon that explains what are the elements of safe environment in Syria. I would like to move to Vladimir. So the prerequisites for elections as defined in the Geneva Resolution 2254 have not been fulfilled or even discussed yet. And we all heard previous UN Special Envoy Stefan de Mistura, who pointed out in 2017 that it will take at least 3 years to prepare for elections once the political solution has been reached. No work has been done ever since then. So even with all the ad hoc solutions that could be logistically applied, it's still not possible to make voting available, free, even transparent for all Syrians who are externally or internally displaced, without a comprehensive political solution that guarantees the right to vote. So here my question is, what exactly needs to be addressed in advance of any elections in order to have a credible process, provided that there is a political will to reach such a comprehensive solution?
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me. So I would like to to address your question with 4 points. Point number one, I will start with describing the overall problem with the electoral legal framework. So the laws that are governing elections in Syria. The primary framework for political rights and electoral processes in Syria is established by the Constitution from 2012. And the implementation is mostly regulated by General Elections Law from 2014. But there is a whole spectrum of other laws which either complement the election law and constitution, or they regulate civil status and the other processes that directly affect elections. And those are often overseen in political discussions. When we're talking about freedoms of Syrians to vote, when we're talking about independent administration of elections, when we're talking about secrecy of voting and so on, sometimes people are focusing on election law or just the constitution, but not on the other elements. And those are, for example, the civil status law from 2007, the nationality law from 69, the penal code from 49, bunch of presidential decrees, judicial decisions, but also regulations such as regulation on misdemeanors that issues Ministry of Justice. So there is a whole complex network that creates this framework that really needs to be addressed before you can even imagine having credible elections. Now, the key difference between legislative and presidential elections is that the most critical aspects of presidential elections are determined by the Constitution. So this makes electoral reforms particularly difficult as it links it to constitutional reforms. So in other words, if you want to have credible elections, you need to negotiate the changes in the Constitution. On the other hand, some of the key electoral rights that should be protected in the Constitution are not. So they're regulated just by law or just by decision of government or by electoral administration. And then we see erosion of these key rights quite clearly if they are not protected by the Constitution. So in essence, if we analyze the legal framework overall, it does not provide a solid basis for implementation of elections. So even if you would open political space for the opposition, even if you would stop with repressive measures against the opposition, if you would stop unofficial involvement of security services and so on, you would still not have a good framework for credible elections. If you add to that 10 years of conflict, then the weaknesses of these electoral regulations become even more apparent because the conflict is almost completely ignored. There is something in the 2016 amendments to the elections law about IDPs, but nothing about refugees and over 5 million Syrians who are outside the country borders. And of course, the cherry on top is that legal framework allows president to be essentially president for 4 terms from 2000 to 2028. So that's my point number one. The legal framework overall needs to be completely reformed, including the interventions into the Constitution. My point number two is about who is running these elections, electoral administration. And in Syria, elections are administered by a combination of judicial and governmental bodies. And the constitution explicitly grants the mandate to Supreme Constitutional Court to run elections for the president and to adjudicate disputes. So there is direct relationship between the president and the electoral administration because the Constitutional Court is appointed by the president and the Supreme Judicial Council is headed by the president and Minister of Justice. So, and at the lowest level, polling officials are appointed by the governor. So governors, of course, are appointed by the president. And so this setup does not provide for independence of the electoral administration. It relies on judicial bodies that are appointed either directly or indirectly by the president. And the governmental bodies that are involved in the administration of elections do not have specialized departments which can operate in politically independent manner. And of course, on practical level, we saw no evidence of proper trainings and management of polling officials. So that leads me to the point number three. Who votes in Syria? So in general, every citizen 18 years of age has the right to vote. But this right is restricted by law because it introduces various conditions. It is linked to the citizenship, which is defined by the nationality law from 1969. And there are few things in that nationality law that really needs to change in advance of elections. Mothers cannot pass their Syrian citizenship to their children. Syrian women cannot pass citizenship to their husbands. But Minister of Interior can grant nationality and bypass the usual requirements for citizenship. So you have this weird situation where Syrians cannot even abandon their citizenship without permission of the government, but the minister can grant nationality to all deserving foreigners. And we heard some concerns about demographic changes in Syria and how this might affect voting patterns. We have no evidence, but we know it's political concern. When it comes to question who is voting, one important issue to look at is how is voter registration done in Syria? And in the past, the voter registration was linked to the civil registry with some updates in the field prior to elections. But we saw in legislative elections, and now we are seeing in presidential election, that Syrian regime effectively abandoned the process of voter registration. There is no voters list in Syria. The voters list is compiled on election day at polling stations. So we do not have accurate records how many voters, in fact, will be eligible to vote in presidential election. The Ministry of Interior published a number of 18 million voters. Interestingly, in 2016, there were 8 million voters. So the links between civil registry and the voter registry are problematic because civil registry, of course, has also issue with the Kurdish population. It's the whole separate issue. We don't have time to go into it now, but we should note that number of Kurdish ethnic Kurds were kicked out of the civil registry. So considering all this, credible voter registration data are not available, and they are not transparent, and they do not provide any trust that voter registration is done properly. The candidacy, my point number four is candidacy. Candidacy has a number of issues that disqualifies quite a few potential candidates from the opposition that would want to participate in elections, including the limits on how long they have to be in the country and so on. So that needs to be completely changed. And the last, not to take too much of your time at this point, the last point that I will just mention is related to legislative elections, so the parliamentary elections. The electoral system that now exists in Syria, and when I say electoral system, I mean the system of representation. So how many representatives you elect from each district and in which way, is so-called block vote system. It's an old system that was used in Levant region that none of the countries are using it anymore. It's a system that gives huge advantage to the governing party, and we could see that in legislative elections. We could see that not a single candidate from the governing party lost election because how the electoral system works, the block vote system, where voters effectively vote for all the candidates of one party in the bloc. So I'll stop here as introduction and happy to answer more questions on what else needs to be addressed. There are quite a few things, for example, role of the UN, who will be administering elections and so on, but maybe we can come to that point in questions. Thanks for now.
Thank you very much, Vladimir, for this really precious input. And what you said actually is very important because it actually refutes any argument that says we can hold elections in Syria before a political solution, because the political solution should include elements of everything that you just mentioned about reforming the laws in Syria, or even rewriting the constitution, in order to make sure that all Syrians could participate in free and fair elections. And the second point I would like to comment on is about demographic change. Yes, it's true, and we at the association have published a long briefing that actually explains how demographic change is a tool that the regime is using to cement forced displacement in Syria. But of course, this issue can be discussed on later platforms. So I'd like to move now to Hannah. And so Hannah, as it stands now, there are several obstacles to any idea of free and fair elections in Syria, as we mentioned earlier, and as it's provided by the resolution 2254, which are simply insurmountable without a comprehensive political solution and a safe environment. We at SACD have published a report that enumerates these obstacles, which include constitutional, legal provisions, and even logistic and security. And these obstacles actually prevent millions of displaced Syrians from running for elections or from even voting freely. But more than anything else, there is an absence of even the minimum security conditions for elections. Logistical challenges of organizing voting for 13 million displaced Syrians also loom as a challenge to anyone, because as we all know, the crisis of displacement in Syria is actually unprecedented in the world, because the number 13 million is actually a huge number, and it's going to be a very big challenge. So Hannah, can you walk us through some of these specific problems that need to be addressed in terms of the participation of the displaced Syrians in any elections for Syria?
Thank you very much, Haya. So I'm going to focus on those who have been displaced out of the country, and also Syrians who may have migrated out of Syria, so the diaspora population. As we know, this is very considerable. There's approximately 8.5 million Syrian diaspora around the world. And what we've seen when we've been looking at their ability to participate in these presidential elections is that there are multiple problems, both in the framework, so the legislative provisions, and also what happens in practice. So these things would need to be fundamentally changed for this to be a meaningful opportunity, or for people to have a meaningful opportunity to be able to participate. So if we start with the legal framework, overall, it excludes and it lacks safeguards. So first of all, it excludes by restricting the voting to only taking place in embassies and making the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and expatriates responsible for the process, the voting process in embassies. This raises a number of protection issues. First of all, crowds. And if we think, for example, that nearly 2/3 of this 8.5 million are living in Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan alone, we can get a picture of the sort of numbers of people that potentially could want to go and vote. And it's very easy to see that those numbers of people, those sorts of numbers, are not compatible with holding voting in an office setting. A second problem is that by only having voting in embassies, is that these are very centralized locations. So if somebody is living in a different part of the country, rather than in the capital city, it's hard for them to come and take part. A third problem, of course, is that not all countries have embassies. And a fourth and very powerful problem is that the process is run, as I say, by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and expatriates, so essentially by the regime, which of course will deter a high proportion of people who don't feel comfortable participating in that way. A second way that the legislation restricts is that it requires people to have a valid passport with an exit stamp in order to be able to vote. So of course, if people have been forcibly displaced, they may not have an exit stamp in their passport, and their passport may have expired. A third fundamental problem with the legal framework for diaspora voting is that there is a complete lack of safeguards. So, for example, there are no requirements for information transparency. So no requirement that there be publication of how many people have registered or voted in each country. There's also no provision for independent observation of the process or media scrutiny of the process. There is also no provisions for how to make a complaint in a diaspora setting. So if there is a problem, there is no provision for access to remedy. So that's the framework. Then what we've seen in practice following the last few weeks and the polling that took place last Thursday is again a range of problems. If we look specifically at voter registration, which, as Vlad was just saying, is a rather theoretical construct rather than something that was actually adhered to in practice, we saw that it was very inconsistently administered across the different diaspora countries, and that there was a lack of safeguards again. So some of the inconsistencies that were clear is the amount of information that was made available to diaspora to know whether voting and registration was taking place in their country. There were also different deadlines given. While there was the standard of the 25th of April, some places were explicitly saying that you could register after this date. And what we saw in practice is that this date was a nominal date rather than a real deadline, as clearly the push was for people to be able to carry on being registered, or, as Vlad was just saying, just turning up on the day and in practice just being added to a list. So it was all a rather theoretical process. Also, in terms of inconsistencies, in some countries, people were allowed to register from third countries, not just Syrians living in that host country. And again, there was variation on this. Very importantly, there's also a lack of provision for data security or protection of privacy. And this failure to have any of these protections, and to be clear about this, risks reprisals for people who are registering or later seem to be voting, and also rumours to that effect that can then, of course, deter people. So we know the most pronounced problems have been in Lebanon, and the Access Centre for Human Rights has monitored and reported on a number of problems that they saw. For example, Syrian diaspora being told that they had to register in order to still be able to maintain their property in Syria, in order to get papers at the embassy. Also that civil society activists and camp superintendents were being put under pressure to force refugees to register. We also heard reports of this in some other countries as well. So, for example, in Turkey, the completing of forms people were told could result in the pardoning for crimes. These reports continue to come in. So we hear more, for example, about meetings being held in camps, nominally for aid purposes, but then in effect it being about making people register or go to vote, for example, with photographs being taken of each person and pressure being put on people. And there was a very good quote we saw in one article that people should be protected not only from forced return, but also from forced voting. In terms of the campaign for the diaspora, again, there are very striking inadequacies, that it's only 4 days long because the official campaign started on the 16th and polling was on the 20th. It also seemed to be very much about promoting participation rather than actual political choice. So about legitimacy through numerical strength rather than competition between candidates. And as we know, there was a great emphasis on patriotic duty. It was also very striking that there didn't seem to be an effective campaign by opposition groups against the voting process. If we move on to election day itself, the procedures in place were extremely open to manipulation. So as Vlad mentioned, the list of voters wasn't being used, and that's a basic safeguard for having a maximum number of people who vote and to prevent double voting. And as from what we could see, it was typically compiled on the spot. There's no ink when people's fingers are inked to prevent double voting. Ballot boxes were typically unsealed, making it easy for ballots to be added. People were voting without their passports, as is legally required. Ballots were loose and they weren't standardized. We could see that candidates were in different orders in different countries, again, risking that they could be unauthorized ballots could be produced and put in the ballot box. And there was no sign of any candidates' agents present serving as a check on the process. So I'll just finish by saying some of the narratives that seem to be coming from Damascus seem to be about the images. There were very sizable numbers of people going to vote, and we heard ambassadors testifying to 10,000 people having voted in Lebanon by 10 a.m., which doesn't seem compatible with the size of the operation and the number of people that would have to have voted each hour. But nevertheless, there were these images of people queuing for miles to be able to go and vote, and the pressure and intimidation that some of them were put under because of being seen as pro-regime, and so why should they stay in Lebanon? So the violence that they were subject to. In contrast, the other side of the picture, of course, wasn't shown. So all in all, as I would say, there are a number of very specific problems that need to be addressed if this is to become a meaningful process, and that requires change in the legislation, change in who is administering the process, and change in what happens in practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah. It's very good to end actually with what happened in Lebanon, because this is, I'm going to move to Karim to talk more about this. However, with regards to the issue of embassies, so SACD has conducted a survey with 500 displaced Syrians, and we asked them whether they feel safe in voting in embassies, and 82.1% indicated that they do not feel safe to vote in Syrian embassies. So it's very important to be taken into consideration alongside all of the challenges that you mentioned. So Karim, we all have been seeing reports of Syrians being pressured to vote in the Assad elections. Yet this finding is not surprising, considering that Syrian regime embassies, like we just mentioned a while ago, are bases for intelligence operations against Syrians abroad to monitor, intimidate, and in some cases even to assassinate them. So do you think it is at all possible to have Syrians in Lebanon to vote freely without any pressure?
I do think it's quite difficult. First of all, I'm very thankful to be on this panel, and I really appreciate all the insight from the other panelists here. But to answer your question, Haya, yes, it is very difficult, if not almost impossible, based on what I saw, and I've reported on, for Syrians to vote freely in Lebanon. So early on, when the when the Syrian government opened voter registration for the diasporic populations, whether they're diaspora refugees or whatever their status is, we saw lots of mobilizations in Lebanon to round up as many Syrians as possible and have them registered to vote. This particularly came from Syrian government-affiliated groups like the Syrian Workers Association and allied parties from Lebanon, such as the Syrian Social National Party, the Ba'ath Party in Lebanon, and so on. And of course, as what was said earlier, that this is all about sort of legitimizing the Syrian government through a large voter turnout, through numbers, rather than any sort of viable, pluralistic, democratic activity. At the elections as well, we began to hear lots of testimonies from Syrians saying that they were intimidated to vote. This is not anything that's controversial. The UNHCR said that they have received several complaints about it, and they have been trying to look into the situation. I can imagine their hands are quite tied in to what extent they can do these kinds of things. And you could see that if you're in the embassy, by 8 a.m. you have people coming in buses from rural areas from across the country, carrying banners of al-Assad with the logo of the Syrian Workers Association, for example. And you can tell that they've showed up. And Syrian refugees in Lebanon are especially vulnerable. Granted, Lebanon is just next door, but Lebanon's sort of policy on refugees is not very clear, if at all. It's a very sort of laissez-faire policy. They just basically said, just let the international organizations handle it, let them coordinate with the local governments. We don't have an official policy on them. All it is that we don't consider them refugees because we're not part of the Geneva Convention. And they'll have to go home eventually, but we have nothing to do with them. And especially in 2015, when there was a freeze on registering Syrian refugees at the UNHCR, it means that lots of Syrian refugees in Lebanon, or displaced Syrians, or whatever you would like to call them, are unfortunately without any sort of legal protection whatsoever. So this put them at risk of deportation, facing all sorts of violence as well. And there have been cases of deportation. Several years ago, there was an increase of cases of Syrians being deported, some that have been registered formally, but when they went to the authorities to renew them, they would just say, oh, you've been asked, they sent back to the government. And so there are many Syrians who are too scared to leave their homes or their tents just because they fear deportation. So they're especially vulnerable here. And so to go and to vote or to make a political statement in particular that opposes the status quo of the embassy is pretty dangerous, for sure. So I can't imagine this kind of activity. Now, there was a protest several days ago in Akkar in northern Lebanon of a couple of dozens of Syrians condemning the elections and so on. This is a very rare case of Syrians mobilizing this way in Lebanon, but generally speaking, no, it's virtually impossible for them to sort of vote freely or to take any sort of free political action, even though they're not in Syria itself. But the risks are far too high.
Exactly, Karim. This actually brings us to the issue of forced voting. So there has been, a documented pattern of Syrian refugees being forced to vote. Given the examples that you just mentioned, but it's been happening even since 2014. So many of them fear backlash or deportation if they do not present and vote, because it's become an existential issue for them. Especially with reports that the Lebanese government is willing to start to implement its plan of returning refugees back to Syria, and then being, their legal and their status in the country. Like you just mentioned, Lebanon did not make up its mind yet on what is the status of the Syrian refugees who are living here. So, however, regardless of all of these all of these complications, the Syrian refugees in Lebanon and elsewhere are entitled to protection from the state that is hosting them. This is the ideal case. This is the normal case. So, what roles do you think that the Lebanese authorities are playing, and what should be done to stop this interference?
In theory, what ought to happen is that the Lebanese authorities should be protecting everyone in Lebanon, Lebanese or otherwise. It's just their basic job. Unfortunately, when it comes to refugee populations, this is also similar to what happens with Palestinians here in Lebanon as well, is that the Lebanese government tries to just, cast them elsewhere. And even though they are technically subject to protection under the law, Lebanon does not believe that it's obliged to protect them the way that they should be protecting refugees, because they are not party to the Geneva Conventions. So they use the term displaced and all other legally ambiguous terms to help them sidestep these things. Of course, we do know that the UNHCR and human rights organizations that have looked into this have called on the authorities to protect Syrian refugees who are facing threats and violence and so on. But of course, we know that it is very difficult. We've almost never see any sort of proactive security measures taken by the state, by the security agencies of the central state, to protect refugees. In this case, Syrian refugees who basically are taken care of depending on which municipality they live in. So we don't necessarily see that, unfortunately. And of course, because of the intertwined politics between Lebanon and Syria, it's a bit of a tricky situation. Granted, Lebanese-Syrian relations are not normal again. They're still sort of neutral and a bit cold compared to what they were, let's say, in the 90s. But there is still, for example, security coordination between the two countries. Between the general security in Lebanon and the Syrian security agencies and so on. And this is the case. And of course, what's especially more concerning as well is that it's not just Syrians who are being just forced to vote against their will, but there are also lots of Syrians who are living in abysmal conditions in Lebanon. We're talking skyrocketing poverty rates. They're really struggling because they don't have any protections from the Lebanese state, which is already virtually like bankrupt, and the donor fatigue. So many Syrian refugees I've spoken to say that they just they feel that voting will give them a sense of normalcy and they can go back home, but at the same time they fear repercussions by the Syrian state. They might have taken protests, they might have opposed the government at one point, they must have maybe a few debts that they owe. So there's also a lot of pressure on them to go and vote from these different organizations by saying, look, you can go back to Syria and you will not face reprisals. So these kinds of, shady practices, I think, that put Syrians at even greater risk. Unfortunately, the Lebanese state has to protect them, just like they protect anybody else. But unfortunately, that's not happening. And one can argue that now, the state security services in Lebanon, whether it's the internal security forces or the army or whatever, with the economic crisis, they're not being paid properly. Their salaries have diminished by 90%. All these things, but I'm focusing basically on a trend of protection of refugees since 2011, and based on Lebanon's sort of laissez-faire policy, this is basically non-existent. Unfortunately, if you go to Syrian refugee camps, they're sort of administered by camp superintendents. In Arabic, they're called shawish, and a lot of things just go on there which allow for these kinds of political threats and practice to take place. Unfortunately. So what is expected and what is happening are two very different things. And the UNHCR, my understanding is that they have been trying to look into these situations, but it is highly unlikely to lead to some resolution going forward. And I mean, the voting took place last Thursday anyway. And we don't even know if, on another note, we don't even know if we will see any sort of justice for Syrians who were beaten up in cars on their way to the embassy by Lebanese partisans. So unfortunately, I think refugees, in any case, suffer virtually no protection and rely heavily on international organizations to provide them with these kind of protection services, but of course, no actual police or state security agency.
Exactly, Kareem, and just like you just mentioned a very valid point that the lack of security that the Syrian refugees have been living in Lebanon it's been a trend ever since they came to Lebanon, and it's because of the situation of the Lebanese state, and this requires the international community to actually step in and to provide mechanisms to protect the refugees. So I would like to move to Hannah, and afterwards I will move to Dr. Hala because Dr. Hala has to leave shortly. But just so that we are our ideas are just a bit organized. Very shortly, Hannah, if just like Kareem mentioned a while ago, and all the other guests, so mechanisms to enable registration and reward voting for the millions of displaced Syrians, they simply do not exist. And so this requires that we have bilateral protocols and memorandums of understanding to be signed in order to allow Syrian refugees to vote in special arrangements. Other issues that refugees face that they lack any ID or documentation, especially those who were forced to leave. And just like Kareem mentioned in Lebanon, especially with the case of UNHCR, where Syrian refugees are not being registered, so they are not even legally documented in the country. So not to mention the situation of the IDPs who are displaced within and outside regime-held areas, which even adds more complications to the issue. So how do you think this could be resolved? I mean, legally speaking, what should be done in order to document these people, in order to provide them with valid documents, in order to have actually bilateral protocols that allow people to vote outside embassies, because like we mentioned, embassy voting is not the ideal situation for many reasons. So what do you think needs to happen for them to actually participate in a real and meaningful election? In 5 minutes, because I have to move to Dr. Hala afterwards, please.
Thank you. I'll be very brief because clearly working out solutions to problems like this is more than a 5-minute exercise. But just to say, basically, this would be a very, very large-scale operation for out-of-country voting or diaspora voting. And there have been experiences in the past, for example, with Iraqi elections, Libyan elections, the South Sudan referendum, where large-scale diaspora voting has taken place, including actually in Syria for the Iraqi elections. So there are frameworks to go back to, and lessons can be learned from these exercises that have been done before. So I think that's the first thing, to sort of consider what we know about what the situation is and what has worked in the past and what needs to happen. Clearly, it would be much better if there's an international framework for this. So there's a sort of harmonization rather than the somewhat ad hoc arrangements that there are at the moment. And also a rationale worked out for in which countries voting could happen in and should happen in. There's obviously a very big concentration of Syrian diaspora in certain countries, but there's also a spread across many countries across the world. So that's the first thing, a sort of international framework for this. Secondly, to remove legal barriers and strengthen the legislation. So as I referred to earlier, there are a number of obstacles in the legal framework which would need to be changed. So things like expanding the range of documentation that can be used, expanding the locations beyond embassies, ensuring that there are transparency measures, making sure all those things are introduced, and that there's a sort of consensus of some sort around the legislation. Another thing is to have early planning and research. This will all take time to work out because it is so complex. And I refer back to the issues that you mentioned. And this needs to be worked out both at a central level, so who would be responsible for both overseeing, supervising the process and administering, and that these bodies must be independent and there must be provisions for that independence and accountability. Also, the cost that would be involved in doing a complex operation like this and how long the lead time would need to be. And then very specific country information would need to be gathered to know exactly what the needs are in Lebanon, how they're different to Turkey, to Jordan, etc., so that the specific needs of people can be met so that there is an opportunity for de facto participation. Another important thing to bear in mind would be early discussions with host countries. So as we saw in this election, in the voting on Thursday, both Turkey and Germany did not give their agreement, which is within their right as host countries for voting to take place. Earlier, the Syrian embassies and consulate, in the case of Turkey, had announced that voter registration would happen, etc. This is clearly unfair for voters to be in this situation of not knowing if it's happening or not. So clearly, early agreements need to be worked out, so that host countries can give their permission for it, and also provisions be made, for example, for security, etc. Then the specific policies would need to be worked out on the exact procedures involved, on how data would be protected, how information would be put out, how complaints would happen in practice, how the whole process can be published, can be clear and transparent. I would say another crucial element to bear in mind is for having community involvement, that displaced populations should themselves be involved in working all these things out, and then involved in the administration of the elections in some way. So it's not this mysterious thing being done by a government body, but something that people are part of. And then there are more specific things, of course, that would need to be worked out, such as security. And again, this would need to be a country by country provision, and much broader than just having security guards at a polling station, but also about protections from repercussions and reprisals that can happen to people participating. Then there would also need to be preparation for scrutiny of the process, so preparation for candidates, agents to play a meaningful role, for independent observation, and for media to be able to see what's going on. And as I say, the final thing that I would emphasize is the need for having a complaint system, which is quite complicated when it crosses many jurisdictions and people are taking part in different places around the world. So that's just some food for thought of the range of things that will take time to work out, but need to be done in a step-by-step way in order to have a process that does give meaningful opportunity and that people feel part of. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hannah. Indeed, like you mentioned, this will take years and this will take a lot of work. We have so much to fix before holding free and fair elections to Syria. So Dr. Vladimir, I will come back to you just because Dr. Hala has to leave in a while. So Dr. Hala, there are 13 million displaced Syrians and hundreds of thousands of detainees and forcibly disappeared people who are deprived of the right to freely vote and to run for office. So how can we discuss elections when hundreds of thousands are detained or disappeared precisely under the accusation that they were against the regime, which is very ironic, and a proof that there is absolutely no political freedom whatsoever in Syria. And even today, Syrians living in Assad-held areas are subject to arbitrary arrest, forced disappearances, harassment, extortion, beatings, and torture. And you mentioned earlier that people could simply be detained for a Facebook post. So entire areas are being subjected to brutal siege and bombardment for this reason. So, yet opposing the regime, it must be a natural political platform in any free and fair elections. So, what legitimacy can any elections have with people who are seen as anti-regime being unaccounted for or unable to run or vote?
Yeah, thank you, Haya. I think what you say that this is a clear evidence that no fair election can be done in Syria, while hundreds of thousands of people are in arbitrarily disappeared. More than 13 million IDPs and refugees. How they can do this election and exclude this huge portion of Syrian people. So unless any transitional solution can be done and release for all these detainees and have their rights and give the rights to IDPs and refugees to give their votes and to the candidates in the election. No fair and safe election can be transparent. I mean, transparent election can be done in Syria in this situation. For me, absolutely, I didn't imagine that the Syrian people, even in regime-controlled areas, can give their voices free without fear to being tortured or beating in the regime-controlled area, not to giving their voice to Bashar al-Assad and anyone related to the regime. So I think unless release for all the detainees and have the rights for all the people, the IDPs, I mean, and refugees, we cannot trust any fair election in Syria.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hala. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Vladimir, let's end it with you today. And we have discussed so far all the surpassing. We have discussed so far the obstacles to free and fair elections in Syria, and we mentioned that it will all require robust international support and a comprehensive framework that, most importantly, Syrians believe and perceive to be legitimate. And so such a framework can only be implemented as part of a comprehensive and sustainable political solution that guarantees a safe environment for all Syrians, including the displaced people. So such a safe environment will include fundamental security, constitutional, and election law reforms, like we have been speaking a while ago. So what do you think is the position of the international community and the UN on the current presidential elections? What would be the role of the UN and the international community in elections, provided that there is a political agreement to hold legitimate elections?
So there are a few questions in your question, so let me try to unpack them. When it comes to UN and how the UN considers these elections, I think the answer is very easy. It's simple. The UN is assessing elections through several lenses. One of them is, of course, the Security Council Resolution 2254, which does require for elections to be inclusive, to be credible, and in accordance to international standards. Even in situations without a conflict, even in situations that are not like Syrian environment, the UN would be assessing elections against the international election standards. International election standards are codified in international treaties, in treaties that are linked to the international public human rights. And if we are observing these elections according to that framework, according to the framework of international election standards under the human rights treaties, then we see that these elections cannot be credible. There are no building blocks that make these elections credible, no matter what political opinion of anyone is. So in terms of UN, I think it's fairly clear. In terms of what we call Western countries, in lack of a better term, I don't particularly like that term, but let's use it here. They are also fairly clear that these elections are not legitimate elections. They are not within the framework of the Security Council resolutions. They're not contributing to resolution of the 10-year conflict. And again, they cannot be measured against the international standards. But even some of the, Syrian regime-friendly countries, again, in a lack of a better term, even they do not necessarily hail these elections as something that is credible and that they can completely support, because they are also part of the efforts to reform the constitution, to bring parties to an peace agreement, and to have transitional process. Uh, Russia is part of the effort to establish constitutional committee and to reform constitution and electoral processes through this constitutional committee. Russia was part of the Security Council resolutions, for example. Iran's position is maybe more lenient, but in general, I think while some countries will be not so critical toward presidential elections, I don't think they will be considering them as credible and as a stepping stone for resolution of the conflict. When it comes to second question, what would be the role of UN in implementing transitional elections, future elections? The answer is complicated. There is simply no agreement what would be UN role. Quite a few people are pointing out that Security Council Resolution 2254 provides mandate to UN, and it says that the elections will be implemented through supervision of the UN. Now, the problem with that is that supervision doesn't mean anything in terms of electoral standards and in terms of international law. Supervision can mean many things. If the language would have said administered, that would have been a little bit clearer. If the language would have been observed, that would have been clearer. Supervision, unfortunately, it's a problematic term that effectively will require another agreement what the UN's role will be. The only thing that we can do is to look back into some other countries and some other examples, how the UN was involved in transitional elections. But when we do that, we see a variety of the ways. So, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, the UN shared responsibility for administration of elections with national election bodies. In Namibia, it had almost complete control over the electoral process, where special representative of UN Secretary General was essentially chief election officer. So there are various ways how UN was involved, and it was on the basis of agreement and mandate given from security councils. And there are variety of ways how that was implemented in the past. And we can go back as far back as 20 years, look at East Timor, look at Cambodia, Namibia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, and so on, and we will find different models of UN's role and UN's involvement. So the bottom line is, even in discussions with some Syrian interlocutors, Syrian opposition that is advocating for the role of UN, people have different opinions what should be that role. And there is lots of arguments between various opposition sides how much of UN's involvement there should be. And then they're looking toward election experts like Hannah or me to interpret for them what UN supervision means. And unfortunately, we have to say it's ambiguous term. It will have to be better defined. Why is that super important? Because definition of UN's role will have to be built into the agreement. And if the agreement, and when I say agreement, I mean political agreement to bring conflict to the close and have transitional process. And at this point, the only thing that is on the table is the Constitutional Committee. No matter how problematic work of Constitutional Committee is, as we know, it's being now on hold. But that is the only thing that it's possibly happening in terms of negotiations. And so if we are talking about Constitutional Committee negotiations, we are talking about constitution and therefore the role of UN will have to somehow be built in the constitution of the country to allow foreign involvement or UN multinational involvement in Syrian elections. So I will stop here, although I'm afraid that I didn't bring much more clarity, but that is the reality, that the clarity on UN's involvement, we still need to come to that point to be able to answer that question. So thanks for your question for now.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. And indeed, just like you mentioned right now, that's the reality. It's a complicated reality. And in fact, talking about any elections in Syria at the time being is extremely immature because we do not have the circumstances that allow for these elections, neither constitutional, nor legal, nor security, nor logistic circumstances to allow for these elections. And the Syrian regime is the main driver of displacement of the Syrian people. It has committed war crimes. It has used chemical weapons against the Syrian people, and it cannot be trusted to allow any free and fair elections in the eyes of the displaced Syrians and in the eyes of the Syrian people in general. And any attempt to legitimize the elections by the organized by the Syrian regime, or to even attempt to organize elections without political solution that ensures a safe environment in the country, will only lead to more and more destabilization. So we are really looking forward to the days when Syria is ready to hold elections. We would hope to have all of you as experts providing us with your experience on what should be done and what reforms we should have to hold free and fair elections in Syria. To us, it's like a dream, but it's okay to dream. We are dreaming of a better future for our country, and hopefully we could have free and fair elections as soon as possible. I would like to thank my guests very much. Thank you very much, Hannah. Thank you very much, Vladimir. Thank you very much, Karim. It was an honor to have you with us today, and I hope to see you again very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Good luck.
Take care, everybody.